industrial manufacturing plants, one of the country's most important shipping ports, and a thriving aquatic tourism industry, Long Beach is uniquely vulnerable to flooding. For ease of comparison with other similar studies conducted in Long Beach, the scenarios I chose to analyze for the project are shown here. They range from 25, 50, 100, and 150 centimeters of sea level rise at average conditions, as well as with the 100-year storm event, which is just a fancy way of saying a really severe storm that has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. This animated map is a visualization of these 8 scenarios in the city of Long Beach. The darker the blue, the more severe the scenario. And while the sea level rise model I used does not predict the time frame in which we can expect these changes, I realize that is not entirely useful when it comes to decision making. California has developed guidance for decision makers when planning for coastal impacts, and these 2 diagrams depict an approximate time frame in which they can expect varying stages of sea level rise based on future carbon emissions. In essence, the more greenhouse gases are emitted, the quicker sea level rise is predicted to occur. As this graph shows, not only have we already experienced measurable sea level rise in the past 100 years, it is predicted to rise steadily and obviously over the next 80. When I tell my friends that I'm studying the impacts of sea level rise, this is probably what they think I'm doing. But in reality, the past 10 weeks looked a lot more like this. I used the United States Geological Survey's Coastal Storm Modeling System, lovingly referred to as COSMOS, for sea level rise and coastal storm predictive data, and compared it to data from the LA County Tax Assessor's Office that included the total property value of all land parcels in the city of Long Beach. First, I looked at potential losses of that property value, but there's a lot of research out there already looking at that. What I really want to talk to you today is the economic impact that a loss of business infrastructure can do to the local, county, state, and federal economies outside of just direct impacts to Long Beach, or the ripple effects of sea level rise and coastal flooding. To do that, I obtained sales volume and employee data for the businesses in the area predicted to flood, and ran each of the 8 scenarios through an economic impact analysis program called IMPLAN. What this model spits back are the indirect and induced impacts of these potential business losses. So what does that really mean? Direct impacts are exactly what they sound like. For the sake of this project, I considered that a business flooded can no longer operate, so the people who work there no longer have jobs, and the sales that business makes are no longer made. Indirect impacts are losses experienced as a result of the flooded business. For example, if an industrial facility in Long Beach closes down and they source some of their equipment and tools from Northern California, the equipment provider loses business, as well as the airline company who made the weekly delivery trip, the source metal company in inland California, and so on. And the induced impacts reflect the spending of wages from the impacted communities. When that particular industrial facility closes, the employees lose their jobs, and if it takes them a bit of time to find a new one, they might shop less at the local retailers, make coffee at home instead of buying a latte at the local cafe, or even move elsewhere to find work. So what you're looking at here are my predicted direct, indirect, and induced impacts of business loss due to flooding at each sea level rise scenario. What you might notice immediately is the big jump between 50 centimeters of sea level rise with average conditions and the same with the storm event. The difference is drastic. This can be partly explained by a parcel predicted to be impacted with the storm event that contains a company called West Air Gases and Equipment, which reports almost $3 billion in yearly sales, represented here in the horizontal stripes. Similarly, between 100 centimeters of sea level rise at average conditions when compared to the same with the storm event, another significant parcel becomes vulnerable, one containing a company called United Rentals, which reports almost $1 billion in yearly sales, represented here with the vertical stripes. It's clear that these 2 companies are incredibly important local industries, and their damage would lead to serious ripple effects throughout the economy. And those ripple effects don't only stay where the loss is experienced. The impacts travel far beyond the city limits. As an example, these maps represent the cascading effects at the most severe scenario I analyzed. While the predicted losses of the city to the city of Long Beach itself were the highest, the county and state each stand to lose over $1 billion in additional sales as a result. And when it comes to tax implications, these impacts know no state boundaries. While the state of California could lose nearly $1 billion in tax revenue due to lost sales and income tax, the federal government stands to lose an additional amount by way of lost collections on social insurance, import and production taxes, and corporate profits. I'd also like to point out the tiny red speck of Long Beach when compared to the rest of the coast of California. Sea level rise will impact more than just Long Beach, leading to similar losses elsewhere that could all add up to big impacts for our country. So after completing my analysis and looking at the various results, I realized this. There was a tipping point in which the economic impacts between the scenarios went from modest to major and continued to go up from there. And that was 50 centimeters of sea level rise with a 100-year storm event. At the lower scenarios, economic disruption was significant but modest, hovering between $200 to $330 million per year. But between 50 centimeters of sea level rise at average conditions and the same with a storm event, the direct economic impact more than doubles. In the bar chart I showed a few slides back, there were some huge jumps in loss between scenarios due to the loss of 2 parcels housing those particularly large businesses. Well, this chart here removes the impact of both of those businesses, and the drastic jump between the two is still incredibly significant. What's important to take away about this chart is this: the line is not straight, which means that the economic impacts of sea level rise in Long Beach will not increase at a steady rate. Instead, the impacts may be modest for the time being, but there is an established tipping point when the community is suddenly significantly more vulnerable than it was at a previous scenario. City officials, coastal developers, and home and business owners should plan their adaptation measures for the future accordingly, instead of expecting sea levels to rise at a slow and steady rate. As I mentioned earlier, USGS does not include years of impact alongside their sea level rise predictions, so I set out to try to understand when the Long Beach area could expect this tipping point to occur, and if it was within the lifespan of coastal development projects that might be in the process of conception and design today. With no mitigation and continued high carbon emissions, the light red line depicts sea level rise projections with a 1 in 200 likelihood, while the darker red lines depict the upper, mid, and lower ranges of what the California Ocean Protection Council's sea level rise guidance documents refer to as the most likely to occur, recommending that developers and policymakers stick to the upper limits of these projections. So, as the graph shows, by the year 2070, which is only 50 years from now, Long Beach is likely to hit that critical tipping point where the economic disruption from sea level rise with a large storm event is predicted to go from modest to major. Due to the lack of availability of flood coverage by private insurance markets, the US government established the National Flood Insurance Program in the 60s, which operates under the Federal Emergency Management Agency, aka FEMA. The program covers both residential and commercial properties with varying degrees of requirement, coverage, and policy types. But what really struck me during the course of my research was this: FEMA doesn't take climate change and sea level rise into consideration when designing their insurance policies. LA County is likely to hit this tipping point of economic impact and sea level rise within the next 50 years, and I showed you over the past few minutes what those losses could be, and they are big. In the hands of agencies like the California Coastal Commission, this analysis can better equip local decision makers to understand the full implications of approving or denying permits for new coastal development and can design sensible resiliency policies to help safeguard communities. State sea grants could use this research to inform decisions on where to send funding or fellows. The City of Long Beach is currently completing their own economic analysis of sea level rise, and this work can provide complementary results to their as their climate action plan goes through its public comment period and is eventually adopted. With each new analysis completed on the predicted impacts of sea level rise, we can get a better understanding of what we're up against. One small drop in the pond of impact analysis can make a ripple effect of change, but lots of drops can create a wave of change, and we can then do our best to help prepare the country for when the water comes. I'd really like to thank my Capstone Committee, with the chair, Dr. Kate Rickey, and Laura Engelman here at Scripps, and Chloe Fleming and Sean Regan from NCOS and NOAA, and everybody else in this room, and everyone who has supported me along the way. Does anybody have any questions? Up there, yes? Oh, hi, Rodrigo. I don't have my glasses on.
So, there's no frontiers. Like, how you see the room that the local people have to act in the face of the sea level rise? Like, suppose that the trend of sea level rise is going to go up and up besides migration and just push the problem to, like walls that push the problem to other places, what's the role people have to act in this? I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot that people can do in the short term, but there is, like what you're talking about, migration. Some people call it managed retreat, which is a little bit more diluted of a language. And that is something that some folks in Long Beach are recommending, managed retreat plans over the next 50 years. But there are some adaptation projects that you can do. You can help restore wetlands that can help catch some of the wave energy and decrease the impact that it can bring into the buildings or into the cities. You can do things like seawalls, and what Long Beach is doing right now, they're doing a lot of beach nourishment, which means they're taking sand from one area of the beach and trucking it over to another area to help, again, try to protect from wave energy and from the inundating water. There are a lot of adaptation measures, but I think what's really important about work like this is it talks about it on a local scale, so the communities themselves can really figure out what adaptation strategies are right for their community, instead of having the state of California saying, here's what the whole coastline should do, build one big giant wall. Trigger, but yeah.